People see things as they are and say why. I dream things that never were and say why not.
Robert Francis Kennedy. His fight for equality and justice inspired a nation. And in 1968, Robert Kennedy's family and friends founded an organization dedicated to realizing his dream of a more just and peaceful world. The Robert F. Kennedy Center for Justice and Human Rights has supported heroes on the cutting edge of social change for over 4 decades. The RFK Center has honored the work of human rights activists around the world, and that's just the beginning. The center creates partnerships with activists and achieves meaningful and measurable results to help them accomplish their missions.
We help them on the ground. We represent them at the U.S. Senate, at the United Nations.
And the RFK Center fosters a new generation of human rights activists with their outreach program, Speak Truth to Power.
My name is Hafez Al-Sayed Seda.
My name is Patria Jimenez.
My name is Oscar Arias Sanchez.
My name is Vera Stromskaya.
My name is Elie Wiesel.
My name is Rigoberta Menchú-Tum.
Based on the award-winning book, the play Speak Truth to Power brings to life the words and stories of courageous human rights defenders.
My name is Diana Ortiz. I know what it is to wait in the dark for torture.
Performed on 6 continents.
Quando una macchina senza targa.
And teamed with a photo exhibition and a youth education curriculum, Speak Truth provides a toolkit for action to help students become agents of change in their own communities. And partnering with RFK Europe, the RFK Center's message of advocacy and action is spread globally. In addition, the center sponsors the Robert F. Kennedy Journalism and Book Awards, celebrating the work of writers and journalists who expose social injustice.
There is a Chinese curse which says, "May he live in interesting times." Like it or not, we live in interesting times. They are times of danger and uncertainty, but they are also the most creative of any time in the history of mankind.
Robert Francis Kennedy believed in the power of the individual, that one person, one voice can make a difference. You can make a difference. Expose injustice, heal pain, stop war, right wrong. Support the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Justice and Human Rights.
Good evening. My name is Wyatt Smith, and I'm the Student Body President of Vanderbilt Student Government. On behalf of the 2010 Martin Luther King Commemorative Lecture Series Committee, I would like to welcome you all to the final presentation in this year's series of events. In opening, I'd like to offer 2 quick notes. First, the passing of the holiday honoring Dr. King's legacy reminds each of us to promote service and justice for those in critical need. Towards this end, service leaders from around campus are in the lobby this evening to collect donations for medical relief efforts ongoing in Haiti, led by the Partners in Health non-governmental organization. I ask that you consider being generous in your support of our student relief campaign. Secondly, I would like to offer special thanks and recognition to the individuals without whom tonight's event would not be possible. John Heffernan, the director of Speak Truth to Power; Kay Campbell, administrative assistant to John Seigenthaler; Deborah Flowers and Kay Tyler, administrative assistants in the Office of Religious Life; Emily Stewart, coordinator for the Martin Luther King Commemorative Lecture Series, and the entire MLK Commemorative Lecture Series Committee at Vanderbilt University. Now it is my distinct honor to introduce our moderator for this evening, Mr. John Seigenthaler. A longtime friend and associate of the Kennedy family, Mr. Seigenthaler served as then Attorney General Robert Kennedy's representative to seek peaceful passage of the Freedom Riders of 1961. When the group was attacked at the Greyhound stop in Montgomery on its journey from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans, Mr. Seigenthaler rushed into the angry mob to defend the Freedom Riders, sacrificing blood for the causes of justice and freedom. These have never been lofty ideals for him, rather the cornerstones of our country. Throughout his subsequent career as one of the most respected journalists in America, Mr. Seigenthaler continued to defend our most essential values and remained committed to leading the city of Nashville. He is the former editor, publisher, and CEO of the Tennessean, former editorial director of USA Today, and a nationally recognized leader in American journalism, a legacy that continued through the contributions of his son, who served as an anchor at NBC News for nearly a decade. In recent years, Mr. Seigenthaler has founded the First Amendment Center at Vanderbilt and continues to maintain the busy schedule of someone who refuses to retire from engaging on the tenets of our democracy. His friends and colleagues cross all lines of party and background, and we would all do well to follow his example in bringing light to the issues that divide our country, rather than the heat that so often envelops them today. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce a truly great American, Mr. John Seigenthaler.
Thank you, Ryan. Very nice. Very good. I want to thank you, Mr. President, for that glowing introduction. Good evening. The only way it could be a greater pleasure for me to present Kerry Kennedy to this audience would be if there had been no snow, no snowstorm in the Northeast last evening, and you could see her beautiful face in person rather than as you will see it on that screen. She is, as you know, the daughter of Robert Kennedy, whose love of country and whose service for country made such a difference. In so many ways, Bob Kennedy's life and public service and campaign for the presidency stands for peace and justice, his concern for the poor and powerless, his dedication to politics as an honorable profession, helped us understand the need to change the coarse character and violent culture of our country. He helped us see things that never were, and indeed to ask why. And what he said at home, he said in places where tyranny and injustice and intolerance or violence or indifference abroad in South Africa and Poland, in Indonesia, across Latin America, in those places, as at home, his words and actions offended those in power, gave hope to those who were abused by power, who had been denied and punished because they had no power. I think of his legacy, and I know well what it is. His vision for a newer world lives on in the lives of his children, and they have made contributions to the law, to politics, to government, to the media, and to other fields. With all respect to her several talented siblings, none reflects with more direct meaning that legacy that Kerry Kennedy's work in the field of human rights symbolizes. For more than a quarter century, her work in the field of human rights at home and around the world has made a powerful, palpable difference. With her father's vision in mind, she created the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Human Rights to protect the values embodied and embraced in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. With courage and passion, she has unearthed abuses involving torture, repression, suppression of free expression, maltreatment of children and of women at home and all around the world. Her center has honored and heralded the courageous work of heroes, and 3 of them are here tonight, who have confronted unjust power on behalf of oppressed people. She chairs the Amnesty International Leadership Council, has worked in that organization to stop violence against women. She has campaigned against the death penalty. She is on the advisory committee of the International Campaign for Tibet, on the board of the Committee for the Administration of Justice in Northern Ireland. She's been honored by Lech Walesa, the president of Poland. If I recite all of her involvement in human rights issues and organizations, or all the awards she received, there won't be time for her to speak to you. She has helped us in so many ways understand just what it means, as the title of her book suggests, to speak truth to power. The night of Martin Luther King's death, her father, Robert Kennedy, went into the inner city in Indianapolis and addressed a crowd, most of them not knowing that Dr. King had died earlier in that day. He spoke to them with passion and from the heart, and closed his words by asking them to say a prayer for their country and to help, as he said, tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of the world. As you will hear in a moment, Kerry indeed speaks truth to power, for all she has meant to the cause of human rights at home and abroad, for all the inspirational hope she has given to so many brave people, such as the members of our panel tonight, and for all she does to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of the world. It's my loving pleasure to present to you Kerry Kennedy.
And welcome everyone. I'm so sorry I can't be with you tonight. Can you see me? No. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm just so sad not to be with you, but I'm happy that the good people down in Nashville have been able to hook us up by Skype. I want to talk to you a little bit tonight about the work that I do in human rights, how I got involved, Speak Truth to Power, and the RFK Center for Human Rights, and we'll get right to our panelists. John mentioned that where I grew up, how I grew up. My father, of course, Robert Kennedy, was Attorney General when I was very, very young. And John then worked as a special assistant to my father at the height of the civil rights movement. I remember at that time I have 10 brothers and sisters, and my father really didn't separate his work life from his home life. So he would go off to work in the morning, and my mother would pile 6 or 7 of the kids and 3 or 4 dogs and a football into the back of her convertible, and we would go down to Washington to visit my dad's office, and there John would be, and my father, and many others, and we would talk to them for a while, and then she always took us down into the basement of the Justice Department and across through this tunnel to the bottom of the FBI building, where we would watch the sharpshooters at practice, and this was one of our favorite things to do. At the time, J. Edgar Hoover was the head of the FBI, the director of the FBI, and he did not like my father. And he especially did not like all of his children. And he really didn't like it when he walked into his office one day and my brother Bobby and my brother David had climbed onto his desk and were trying to pick the lock and back of his desk. With no sense of humor about that at all. But one time when my mother had taken us down to see the sharpshooters, she took out her red pen and she wrote a note and put it into the little box there there was the suggestion box in the bottom of the FBI. By the time she had rounded up all the kids and the dogs and gotten us back to my father's office, a FBI agent had opened that box, taken out her suggestion, brought it to J. Edgar Hoover, who read it, and then sent it over to my father's office. So just as we were walking back into his office, my dad, was opening up that suggestion from my mother. And it read, "Get a new director." So this was an early lesson in the importance of speaking truth to power. On another visit to the Justice Department, my father wrote me a note, which I have framed in my home today, and it says, "Dear Kerry, a few moments ago, 2 Negroes were allowed to register at the university over the objections of Governor George Wallace. It happened just a few moments ago. I hope these events are long past by the time you get your pretty little head to college." And that letter has stayed with me all these years, and especially the memory of the people who fought so hard for civil rights in our country and their colleagues around the world, people like those who are on the dais tonight, and people especially like John Seigenthaler. When I was a sophomore at college, I imagine many people in the audience are in college now. When I was a sophomore, I took a internship at Amnesty International in Washington, D.C., and I spent that summer documenting abuses committed by U.S. immigration officials against refugees from El Salvador. And at that time, all of Latin America was under right-wing military dictatorships. Today, there's not a right-wing military dictatorship left standing. All of Eastern Europe was under communism. Today, there's not a communist leader left standing. South Africa was under apartheid. Today, South Africa has enjoyed free elections where a majority of the people have elected their leaders. And at the time, women's rights was not on the international agenda. Today, CEDAW, the Women's Rights Convention, has been ratified by 183 countries. We have come a long way. And those changes happened not because governments wanted them to. In fact, governments tried to stop them. And not because militaries wanted them to. In fact, great armies tried to stop them. And not because multinational corporations wanted them to. In fact, multinational corporations tried to stop them. But because small groups of determined people, as Margaret Mead pointed out, harnessed the dream of freedom and made it come true. And today, as we face the extraordinary problems that we look at around the world, the problems in the tragedy in Haiti, the problems of terrorism in Pakistan, of bringing peace in Iraq and Afghanistan, of all of the issues that face women around the world, of bringing people back from who have still lost their homes and haven't been able to return after Hurricane Katrina, the problems faced by immigrants around the world and by migrant workers. We have to keep in mind the capacity of small groups of determined people to create change. I spent 2.5 years traveling around the world and interviewing the bravest people on earth about the meaning of courage. And I spoke to people like Elie Wiesel, who of course survived the Holocaust as a child. And he said, "My dream for the future is that your children won't have my past." And Archbishop Tutu, who was one of the leaders in the anti-apartheid movement, and he said, "We don't have a God who says, 'Ah, gotcha.' We have a God who lifts us up and dusts us off and tells us to try it again." And that to me those to me are the bookends of human rights. On the one hand, trying to stop the abuses, and on the other hand, having a firm belief in the capacity of the human spirit to triumph even under the worst of circumstances. And I interviewed Marian Wright Edelman. She was the first woman and the first African American to pass the bar in Mississippi. And she did that in the 1960s so that she could represent civil rights leaders. And she said to me, at a certain point in your life, everybody has to open up that envelope in our soul that tells us what we're doing here on earth. And she said, I was blessed at a young age to find a cause that to me was worth dying for.
And that has made every day of my life worth living. So I think that's what we're all struggling for, isn't it? To find a cause that makes every day of our life worth living. And indeed, the people who you see on this stage tonight have found causes that, for them, make life worth living each and every day. Tonight, I want to show you two short films. The first is, I think I don't have these mixed up in order, but the first is going to be a series of 5 or 6 public service announcements about some of our human rights defenders telling their stories. Each one is about 30 seconds. If we could roll that film.
If you believe that every person matters, that every person has a story and a voice that deserves to be heard, then you must believe that what all human rights defenders do everywhere is worth doing. Let us never develop a sense of futility. For the people we honor tonight have proved the wisdom of Martin Luther King's timeless adage that the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. Thank you very much.
My name is Gabor Gombos. I am from Hungary. One day, doing my work, I visited an institution. There was a relatively young man with severe mental retardation in a cage. We asked the staff how much time he spent there. The answer was all day, except for half an hour when a staffer works with him. And I asked him, why do you keep this person in the cage?
The phone rang, and the man said, I know who you are. I know your name. I know where you are located. I know where you live.
I know your name, Marina Pisklakova. I know where you live, Marina. My Marina. I am going to kill you, Marina Pisklakova.
I started the first domestic violence hotline in Russia in 1993, almost by accident. My son has a classmate, and his mother asked me for advice. When a button fell off her husband's suit, and it was not fixed quickly, he took a shoe and slapped her in the face. She called me one evening, really distressed and hurt, half her face black and blue, and I said, why don't you just leave him? And she said, where would I go, Marina? I depend on him completely. So I started thinking that I should help her. I should refer her to somebody. And then I realized that there was nowhere to go. Nobody to help her. So I started a hotline. And then in 1997, we started a new program training lawyers in domestic abuse cases.
I think.
Are you back?
You're back.
I'm back.
Yes.
Okay. Now, John, did you see, were those the PSAs of the from Speak Truth to Power, or was that the play?
The play.
That was the play, okay. So we've mixed up the order a little bit. So that is, as I said, I had traveled around the world and interviewed human rights defenders, and those interviews were written into a play by Ariel Dorfman, which opened at the Kennedy Center and has now played in 17 countries around the world, and many countries multiple times. One of the people depicted in the play, of course, is Marina Pisklakova, who joins you on the podium tonight. I think you have one other video there, which is about 2.5 minutes long, and that is the stories of 4 or 5 of our defenders. Can we roll that video?
It was shown at the beginning. It's already done.
We have
Sean.
Gary?
Yes?
We have
We have trouble with that video?
We've already
Oh, you've already seen it. Okay, well, I'm going to turn this over to the very capable hands of John Seigenthaler. I, again, am so sorry to miss my dear friends Lucas Benitez and Stephen Bradbury and the amazing Marina Pisklakova and everybody in Nashville. I'm so sorry to miss you, and thank you for coming this evening.
Are you there, Kerry?
Not anymore.
Well, I want to tell you how honored I am to be in the presence of 3 people I described as heroes. And I'm going to ask questions, but I will tell you that we're looking forward to having any of you, and as many as possible, join in this conversation and ask questions as well. Let me begin, Marina, with a question to you.
Okay.
I want to ask you about the hotline. In Russia, you created a hotline to protect battered women. I'm interested to know what prompted you to do it, what the reaction, and I know it was hostile, what the reaction to your doing it was, and what the effect of it has been.
Thank you. I started it's not even a hotline, because back in '93 I could only call it Trust Line. It was a helpline for battered women, and when I started I was alone. I didn't know other people who would be really interested. I didn't have any resources. So I started it alone, and I was doing the research. I was working actually at the Academy of Sciences before that. And I was doing the research on what women are most interested in during the perestroika time, because the laws were changing rapidly. Everything was changing for women. And we were just trying to measure what are the major concerns for women are there. And the research was done through publishing a small questionnaire in Women's Magazine.
Let me ask a question, interrupt my own question. How severe was the problem in Russia as it affected women who were victims of domestic abuse?
That's the thing, nobody knew at that time.
And do we know now?
Yes. The main reason I started dealing with that because when I was doing research, I discovered that women started writing letters to me, to the Institute, telling their stories. And I realized their main question, is there anybody who can help me? And then I started interviewing women, and I discovered that it's so common spread, but these women are invisible. Nobody speaks about that. There was no even a name for domestic violence at that time in Russia. And so it was impossible to evaluate a scope of that. And only in '95, at the Beijing conference, the Russian government released the first statistics on the scope of domestic violence in Russia, and it was horrifying because actually, in average, about 14,000 women are killed as a result of domestic violence.
14,000
yes.
a year.
In average, yes.
Were
killed as a result.
Lost their lives to domestic violence.
Yes. It's really more than in any other country I've heard. And latest statistics says that about 60,000 women are regularly abused at homes severely in Russia. Answering your question about what is the effect, today we have a little bit like 20 governmental-run shelters and 2 non-governmental shelters. It's extremely difficult for non-governmental organizations to operate a shelter versus a crisis center, a help center. Because fundraising, because it's really difficult to fit into the governmental criteria for the shelter. Crisis center, counseling center is easier. And there are over 160 counseling centers in Russia for women.
And the reaction to what you did it result in prosecutions?
At the beginning, it was, when you start working in the environment where, at the beginning when I called the police about cases I received on the helpline, for example, I would call the police and say, this man is threatening to kill his wife. He severely, abuses her all the time. There is a baby under 1 year old who is in that environment. So the police officer tells me, yeah, I'll deal with that. And then the next thing I know, he went to the man and said, if you do it, do it quietly. Why do I have an NGO calling me?
The police says, if
to
you're
your
going to
husband.
Do it quietly. There are complaints about it. So no cooperation initially.
At the beginning, there was no cooperation, and when you see threats against me at the beginning, it was, I couldn't go to the police back then because they wouldn't protect me or support me. We started working with the police later. We started working at the end of the 90s, doing training for the police, judges, prosecutors. We developed now training programs for all of those, and we do have cooperation with governmental agencies today.
So finally, the environment has changed?
It is changing. It's not completely changed because we still don't have a law that says specifically that domestic violence is a crime. It's general assault, but it's not domestic violence.
As you know quite well, your country and our country have many similarities, many differences, I know, but certainly in this area, your country and our country live with that disgraceful record.
Well, domestic violence is so common spread. Actually, I've traveled to many countries, and I have to say that in every community. It happens in every community. And I think there is a responsibility of the state, certainly, but it also, I think, involves all the community. I think it is important when people within the community make it, create this really real intolerance. I think when we don't speak about that, or when we don't support people who work on that every day, there is like indirect tolerance to that. And I think it's important that people in every community really make a choice to make their communities just without violence.
Stephen, let me move to you. You've been a community organizer in Louisiana for 20 years, or more or less. You're so young.
Yeah, we'll say less.
But you have really dedicated your life, to state it most simply, helping other people who were unable to help themselves. And I'd like to know what the magnet was that pulled you into that. There must have been so many other opportunities for you. Last campaign, we heard about the President of the United States. I don't know whether it's given you any ambitions.
No.
But I do want to ask you about what it was that pulled you in and got you involved and has held you now for almost 2 decades.
Right. I mean, what got me in probably more than anything else was just my upbringing. I grew up on the south side of Chicago in a working class African-American neighborhood. And so, throughout my life, there were always people who would share things with me. I think about Mr. Brown, who stopped us at maybe 13 to tell us about the Tuskegee experiments with the syphilis. And we didn't really know what he was talking about at the time. Or someone at the bus stop talking about gentrification in the neighborhood as I was on my way to school. And so events like that certainly instilled within me some consciousness about the community and the world, the bigger world that I lived in. The elementary school I went to was a very small Lutheran school. And all of the women who taught there some way really helped us understand that the world was not a friendly place for African Americans, and that we would really have to, one, have a good, firm understanding of who we are in the world, and that we were not less than anyone else, and not to let someone else's bigotry hold us back. And initially I wanted to be a doctor, actually. And then my mother suggested that I take some education classes because, you can always get a job teaching. And as I took those classes, I realized I could impact more people through education than I could as a doctor. And then during one of those breaks between school, I took a job with Acorn. And working with the members, low, moderate income, primarily older women. And at this time, I'd been in New Orleans a while, and had met a lot of activists and whatnot, and people who were always on the news. But this group of people were out doing phenomenal work on behalf of people who they didn't know, and very often they themselves were not going to benefit from the work that they were doing. And at that time, the late 90s, we were working on the living wage campaign. And I really, at that point, decided that I could work for people like that, and just stuck with it throughout the living wage campaign. And then certainly after the hurricanes of 2005, have really just sort of continued on that path.
I'm not sure that any of us this long after we declared war on poverty during Lyndon Johnson's administration, right. I'm not sure any of us, absent that hurricane that lifted the roof off the top of an arena and exposed the running sore of poverty and deprivation that was there. I mean, it was like tearing a scar off a running sore. And suddenly I wondered, where have we been all this time? We've had this war, and we've lost it. You, of course, were continuing to wage it. What does Katrina do to a community organizer whose community is virtually destroyed?
Test your skills.
Test your skills.
Yeah, actually, when the hurricane hit, I was at a meeting in Denver. And so that was the 29th, and flew back into Louisiana on the 31st. And I remember that Monday evening, I was speaking with my father on the telephone to let him know that I was okay. And he said, you know, you can always come home. And just the picture flashed in my head of me sitting on the sofa with the remote control. And I said, no, I think I'm going to go back down. And initially, it was very difficult because the way I've been trained in organizing is everything is about numbers. And when, you know, people are scattered everywhere, there are no numbers to really get a hold of. But one thing we were certain of was that, and this is just based upon, you know, the recent history of the United States, we were quite clear that there would be attempts to take over neighborhoods, to not allow people to come back home and things like that. And so that was really our initial focus, to make sure that everybody had an opportunity to come back if they wanted to. And, you know, one of the things that was unfortunate, I know across the country at that time, a lot of nonprofits attempted to use the opportunity to expose the fact that poverty exists across this country, not just in New Orleans, and even more specifically in New Orleans Ninth Ward as it's been portrayed. But that, unfortunately, was not really, you know, put forth. And so a lot of those efforts have died. And I think that today a lot of people have kind of forgotten that we still have a real serious issue of poverty in this country that has yet to be dealt with.
Thank you. Lucas, you came here, what, a 16-year-old, and you were a migrant worker. You saw fellow workers abused, beaten, maltreated. You started a tomato workers' strike. First time, 500 of them walk off the job.
Actually, 3,000.
1,000?
3,000.
3,000. You know, people here who know I'm a journalist know that I'm usually the one who exaggerates. But 3,000 joined in this strike. Talk about the injustice that you saw that caused you to organize and lead that strike. I mean, there are very few people who don't know the record of Cesar Chavez on the other coast 2 decades ago and more. So few have heard your story. How did you do it?
Now first, my English is not really good, so my friends helped me when my English finished. But I arrived in Immokalee when I was almost 17 years. And I started to work.
In Immokalee, and that is?
Immokalee is in Southwest Florida.
Yes.
So a lot of people, when I mention Immokalee, say, then what country? Oh, nice, in the United States, in Southwest Florida, very close to Naples. So Immokalee is one of the main towns for the agricultural industry, especially during the winter time. 90% of tomatoes is a consumer in the United States during the winter time came from this area. So when I arrived to Immokalee, I expect hard work. But I expect that this verbal abuse and physical abuse. And also, you work 2-3 days and you never see your salary. You never saw your check because the crew leaders, they keep the check when you try to ask for your check, the clearers and many times said, okay, if you don't leave from my house right now, I bid you and you don't do anything. So that's why we started to organize the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. But the first action is we asked for the bad wages. And only in a season, it's an 8-month season in Immokalee. So the 8 months, we collect more than $100,000 in bad wages for more than 500 workers.
This is after you start the strike.
And the strikes came in 1995 when the minimum wage is $4.25 an hour. And one of these big agri-industries is called Pacific Tomato Growers, is one of the big companies that produce tomatoes, reduced the minimum wage from $4.25 an hour to $3.85 an hour. So it's when we decided to go and do something. And we asked the people, what do you want to do? And the people say, okay, we're going to strike. So the strike is focused on Pacific, but the people's, all the community is tired, but a lot of abuses happen. So this strike is going on general strike. More than 3,000 farm workers are going out of the fields for a week. And we don't have any penny in a strike fund. We don't receive any pay for a week. So these companies, they saw what is the reality in 1995. But the farm workers, we don't accept more abuses. And the company, Pacific, is put it back the $4.25 an hour. The other companies paid $4.50, and only one company paid $4.75 an hour. So it's a little bit change we saw. So, and we continue to organize them, and we make more and more actions.
You know, we haven't heard about slavery in this country. We haven't talked about it in a serious way. But you found it existed, and you went to court and exposed it. Talk a little bit about slavery in the 20th and 21st century.
Yeah, but the whole these abuses says the rules to credit the more extreme abuses. In this, in the agricultural industry, the robbery salaries, this has happened all the time. The verbal abuse has happened all the time. So this is the rule to create this big problem, slavery, in this century. In the last decade, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, we work very close with the Federal Department of Justice in Washington to investigate and prosecute 7 cases of the modern-day slavery in the fields.
7 cases of slavery in the fields.
In the fields. And we liberate more than 1,000 farm workers.
And you liberated more than 1,000 farm workers as a result of these 7
cases.
Prosecutions of slavery.
Exactly. And these guys is behind to the bars and in the jails, in federal prison, 15 years. But the last case happened in Immokalee is only in 2008. November 2008, a family received sentences in Fort Myers, federal court in Fort Myers, for 15 years because they have more than 30 workers. They keep these workers behind to the, you know, everybody know the U-Haul trucks. These trucks is lagged for outside. So these people keep the farm workers inside this truck.
Inside the U-Hauls?
Yes, inside the U-Haul. They sleep there. They charge $5 for take showers. They charge for food. They charge for ride. They charge for everything. So these people is in debt all the time. So we saw people that stay there in this situation for a year. They don't have any money and working every day. So when we find this last case, we put in contact with the Federal Department of Justice, with FBI and other federal agencies. and we investigate and prosecute this case. So it's in 2008, only a year ago. So
I know you say of yourself you speak with an accent and may not be well understood, and you have your friend to help you. I will tell you, and I'll say to all three of you, you're all well understood. That's eloquent testimony. When Kerry talks about speaking to power, all of you have. I wonder if there are questions from the audience somewhere. I think there is a microphone. And I'll recognize anybody who raises a hand and wants to ask a question. And if you have to think about it, I know I have other questions, but I generally find that audiences ask better questions than I do as moderator. And so if there is anybody with a question, yes, and there is. And will you help me?
Bienvenidos a Nashville, Senor. Welcome to Nashville. I had a question about whether or not there's a national, I marched with Cesar Chavez many years ago, and I was wondering if there's a national farm workers or migrant workers organization, if you've gotten into that level of organizing. It sounds like you've been very successful in what you've done.
Did you all get it?
But that's in this country, but everybody knows, we have the National Labor Relations Act to protect the workers form a union. So it's right, it's beautiful, it's a nice law. So when you saw this law and you read this law, and they said for exceptions, go to this page. But every worker have a right to organize it, except farm workers and domestic workers. The farm workers, we excluded for the National Labor Relations Act. This Labor Relations Act exists only in California, thanks to Cesar Chavez's struggle, and I think it's in Ohio. It's only 2 states, but there's a local Labor Relations Act. So that's why we fight in different way, but the same target, to protect our rights. We need to change the law. Yeah.
We need to change the law, that's right. Anyone else?
May I add something?
Yes.
I just wanted to expand a little bit on what Lucas is doing, because it's actually what I see in that is part of the bigger issue of trafficking in human beings. Because trafficking in human beings, when you see, it affects actually people for domestic work, and that's where the law doesn't apply, is not applied, right? And then it's in a lot of women from different countries are brought for sexual services, and farm workers, domestic workers. So these are hidden, concealed areas that are not somehow regulated, and criminals around the world who want to, who make a lot of money, it's billions of dollars on that, they use this situation. So it's really related, because in Russia we've been dealing with issues of trafficking in women and children. And it's really also a very significant issue for us.
Another question? Yes? Jim, there is a lady coming with a mic.
Were any of you three, were your lives ever in danger, and how did your families, were they supportive of what you do? It must be a strain.
Would you say it again, Jim?
Yes. With regard to every one of the three, were your lives ever in danger?
Yes.
And secondly, was it hard for your families, if you have a family? Are they supportive? Was it a strain?
Yeah, were you ever threatened? Were you ever in danger? Were you did the system, any one of the three Jim said, or all three?
Sure, it'll be quick. No, my life has never been endangered from my work. And except that community organizers don't get paid a lot of money, my family has been supportive.
Yeah, I listened many times. Threats for crew leaders. Sometimes they follow my car, especially when we're in the middle to these investigations on the slavery. And I'm in fear sometimes because right now I have two kids. One is 3 years old, another is 15 months. So, but my wife's really support because I met her thanks to this job. And my parents are very proud to, with the, ¿qué hago lo que hago? Por hacerlo.
They're proud of your work.
They are very proud of my work. So, and my brothers too, they support my work. So it's why when I go out from the town, my brothers is living close to my house, and they take care of my family.
What about reaction to your work?
Well, yes, I received threats many times, but it's actually mostly from men whose wives came to the center. And the piece that you saw in the plays about the threats, they were made against me and my son when my son was 12 years old. And I couldn't go to the police back then. It was in 96, 97, and had to send my son out of the city and then try to deal with that. And now it's much better because I can go to the police. My family is very supportive, and I wouldn't be able to do this work and raise my son without my parents. My father was Air Force pilot, Soviet officer. So he once asked me, what do you exactly do? and I was trying to think how I can respond to him. And then he said, in a Soviet time, you would be a dissident, right? I said, yes. He said, okay, now I understand.
Stephen, I would like to press you a little bit. Community organizers go against the right grain of powerful interests, corporate interests, political interests. How does that affect you? And how do you feel that sort of pressure that, what you do is abrasive to power, and it rubs power the wrong way. And you brush aside, my life was never threatened, as if...
Well, I'll tell you, I'll answer in a broader, and then, because actually I was going to raise my hand to add some more.
Right.
Because I would be remiss if I did not point out that during the 2008 presidential election, when Sarah Palin and John McCain began to target ACORN as an organization, many of my colleagues did receive death threats, and almost all of our offices had to hire security because several of them had been broken into. So I did want to mention that piece, because although I personally had not, many who I work with, who do much of the same work around the country, had received threats. The thing is that, I live in the community I work for, and, people of power and authority don't tend to come to that part of the neighborhood very often. So I'm usually not that concerned about those types of things. What is more troubling and harder to deal with. Even as my voice is kind of throat because aside from just celebrating the Saints going to the Super Bowl, you gotta get that plug in. There's also been, a lot of celebrating in the Acorn world because James O'Keefe was caught trying to pull another prank. And unfortunately, his pranks hurt a lot of low income and people of color. But yeah, in terms of my own personal dealings in circles, most of the people who I deal with, if they're not low and moderate income people, are generally people who work in the same types of fields. So actually, there's a lot of support in that way. And it's very difficult for the powers that be in New Orleans, at least up until, Acorn, the Congress defunded Acorn, but up until that time, for them to take a stand against an organization like ours because we had done so much, not only in the aftermath of the hurricane, but even prior to that. And certainly mentioning after the hurricane in terms of, elected officials, many of them, owe the continuation of their careers to the fact that we fought for people to come back home. And things like that. But I certainly do expect that the work will be significantly more difficult as the corporate world becomes emboldened by their right to buy our politicians and such.
I noted the President said something to the Supreme Court about that last night. I'm sure it made your heart sing. Well, I'm not sure, did it?
Well, I didn't listen, but I understood that his comment was to Congress.
Well, it made my heart sing.
Either way, I know I will be pushing on that issue to see if we can get some laws passed to change that, since the role of the courts is to uphold the law.
Another question? Yes, there's one here. And one back there. Why don't we take the one in the back first, since you're back there?
This question is for Marina. Could you delineate the women's groups in the U.S. that have been most helpful to you? And if they have not been helpful, how would you suggest we ask the female organizers and the female groups like NOW to assist you in Russia?
I think that the acoustics in Benton don't lend themselves to anything but sermons.
Let me ask again.
That was a very good question, but it was slightly inaudible.
Okay, the women's groups in the U.S., Marina, how many of those have been helpful to you? Like the female organizers, the female issue groups, have they been helpful to you? And if they have not, why?
Actually, that's a very good question, because in '94 I met first American women who lived in Moscow, and they helped me to do the training for my first helpline counselors, because in 1 year I was pretty badly burned out and I couldn't continue the helpline. Two of my friends, Martina Vandenberg and Lisa Hoffman, who came and lived in Moscow, they helped me. And then my first trip here to Nashville was in '95. It was my very first trip to the United States, when it was the State Department, U.S. State Department International Visitors Program, and the focus for me to observe a model of domestic violence work was here in Nashville. So I met with Shelters Coalition here, with judges, prosecutors, and I've learned how the system operates, and that became kind of a model for me when I went back home, trying to see how different agencies should be working together. So the United States played a very significant role in and still is playing, a lot of support from women's groups, and trying to push for legislation, helping us to do a lot of training, bringing different models, a lot of help. So thank you.
There's a question here in the front.
Would it be okay if I ask two questions? I can ask one if one is better. I'll ask two, and then you can decide which you'd like. I was going to ask Lucas if you can tell us a little bit about the Publix campaign, and if there are any things that we can do to help with pressuring Publix to work with the coalition. And then the second question I have is to Stephen. People in your line of work obviously knew before 2005 that what kinds of work wealthy people and employers were putting into preventing communities from organizing and preventing them from gaining power in their workplaces, in their communities, and what kinds of things people were experiencing, obviously. And I was wondering, how did it feel, just sort of personally, to hear people saying that they had just learned that sort of thing was still a reality in the United States, when it seems clear that they could have found out if they had really put an effort into investigating what the conditions in our country are, and how it felt when people would say that Katrina had revealed this for the country.
All right, so in 92, Acorn had a national convention in St. Louis, and the topic at the time was living wages. And so when they got back to Louisiana, I wasn't yet an employee at the organization. The local chapter had decided that they wanted to tackle living wages as a way of dealing with poverty in the city. And so, when I came on board, the case was in court and had been bouncing around for a while. And between 2000 and 2002, when it came out of the courts, we ran a campaign and won at the polls at the same election where Ray Nagin was first elected. And at that election, when it started, there was only one candidate between the mayor and all of the city council who was for living wages. And by the time election day had come, Ray Nagin was the only holdout. And so and then of course, the state Supreme Court ruled against us, so the wages didn't go up in the city, but it did kick off a number of living wage campaigns around the country. I think probably the two most significant were Florida and Ohio. But the fact that people in the United States in general had turned a blind eye to the issue of poverty, to the issue of human rights in the United States in general, I think is a testimony to the success of the right-wing media in that to create a situation. I mean, if you recall, during the Reagan era, there was the whole thing about the me generation. And the country began to move away from thinking of ourselves as part of a community, as part of a social network, and really began to focus on what can I get for me? It's all about me. Do I have, the whole conspicuous consumption, do I have the Cadillac, do I have the big screen TV, and all of those types of things. And in fact, the images that we were shown on TV were all about success and how everyone could pull their bootstraps up and achieve the dream of Ronald Reagan, where everyone has the opportunity to be a millionaire, to the point that right now there are more millionaires in the United States than there are union members. There was, it became an undercurrent, and studies were released, books were put out. The Saguaro Fund had a very important study about what happens when people stop participating in groups. That resulted in the book of Bowling Alone, and how even not belonging to, how getting away from groups even affected people's lifespans, that belonging to an organization, even if it was just a bridge club or a flower group, could increase your lifespan as much as quitting smoking cigarettes. But none of this stuff, was really put out there because on the one hand, you have the corporate thing where we make more money because of this way of thinking, but then in terms of power, it is much easier to control people who are not coming together and organizing. One of the things that the Saguaro Fund also found is that people who participate in organizations are more politically active. Once again, even if it's just a bridge club or a flower group, any type of organization, it's just the ability to have a discourse with someone about things that are happening on the news expands your way of thinking about it. And when you don't have those opportunities, you go by what's fed to you on the television. And in fact, a lot of friends of mine get frustrated because I don't like to talk to them about things that are occurring on the news because that's all they do is parrot what they're hearing they don't understand some of the deeper implications. And so when the hurricane came and blew the roof off or peeled back the bandage or what have you, I personally was not very surprised by people's reactions and actually had hoped that it would do more, that people would take people in power who claim to be on our side would take it as an opportunity to really push some of these issues forward. The fact that it wasn't until last year that we got our first minimum wage increase since the $5.15 under Clinton. I think, while it was a good thing, it was slow and hard to come by. And so, as I continue my work and people who I work with, and certainly, my partners in the human rights world, hopefully, bit by bit, we'll consume that elephant. Or is that bite by bite?
I think of these three stories. I think of the work that Kerry has done to inspire people like this. I think of how each of you has indeed spoken truth to power. And it reminds me that 1968 was a long time ago. In the last campaign, there were moments when I felt the spirit of Robert Kennedy alive in this country once again. I felt that 68 was being reborn, and having all of you here tonight speaking to this audience makes me think that that Robert Kennedy's spirit, that whole idea of speaking truth to power, that whole idea of seeking a newer world, that whole idea of asking why not, is still alive, sometimes in remote places that we never hear about. Thanks to Kerry and thanks to Speak Truth to Power, we've heard from all of you, and I ask this audience to join me in thanking them. Thank you. And I think we're adjourned.